Hey everybody, welcome to What the Flick. I'm Matt Atchity, that's Christy Lemire. We live in glass houses, so we are gonna throw stones at the glass castle.
Yes, not to be confused with The Glass House with Lily Sobieski, which came out like 16 years ago. This is The Glass Castle. It is based on the best-selling memoir of the same name by Jeannette Walls. She was a gossip columnist for a long time in New York. She was on MSNBC, she wrote for the Daily News. But this is the story of her childhood, which apparently all this stuff actually happened. It was crazy. She had crazy alcoholic, dysfunctional father, abusive, horrible man, selfish, flighty mother who was an artist. And it's about how she and her two sisters and their brother learned to fend for themselves despite poverty and squalor and being moved from place to place and not going to actual school for a long time. And it goes back and forth in time between Jeannette as a woman in her mid-20s, as played by Brie Larson, and her childhood, remembering all the things that shaped her and how she has now created this facade for herself that she's a totally different person. But you can never truly escape your past, right? Take a look.
My parents are squatting in an abandoned building on the Lower East Side. They were homeless for 3 years before that, which is pretty much how they raised us.
When did you lose your sense of adventure?
My dad can be extremely cruel, but he dreams bigger than anyone I've ever met.
I can't let you cling to the side your whole life just because you're scared. You were born to change the world. You ain't like me.
I am like you, and I'm glad.
So I feel very mixed about this because I think the movie itself kind of feels mixed about where it's coming from, right? This is written and directed, co-written and directed by Destin Daniel Cretton, who did Short Term 12 a few years back, which also starred Brie Larson, which is one of the movies that kind of put her on the map.
And that's a terrific movie.
And it was great. And one thing he does here that he also did there so well is like, he's very matter of fact about the horrific stuff that happens to these kids, right? Like there's inherent drama in it. He doesn't overplay it. It's not mawkish. He lets it all speak for itself. And there's some really quietly powerful moments. The little girl who plays her for the big chunk of her youth, Ella Anderson, is great and has some really quietly powerful moments with Woody Harrelson as dad and also with Naomi Watts as the mom. But the movie seems to be contradicting its own sense of self in a lot of ways. Because Woody Harrelson's an awful guy. I mean, his character, this father, Rex Walls, he's a monster. But they also want us to think that he's adorable and that his antics are wacky, and we should enjoy how unorthodox his parenting approach is. So I don't know. I'm not sure it hits its marks tonally the way it should. Also, the back and forth structure kind of depletes a lot of momentum for me, right? Because it's episodic in both time frames, and then eventually there's just an explosion of emotion.
Yeah, I think the weak spot in this movie really is kind of the stuff set in the present, or at least, it's in the 80s, so which amazing shoulder pads.
Right, and the multi-strand pearl choker, that shit is real.
Yeah, the shoulder pads are on point in this movie. That's the weaker stuff, partly because the fiance/husband that Brie Larson is marrying,
Max Greenfield,
that character felt completely cliched.
Yeah.
Like that character I felt like had no depth at all and didn't even feel like a real person. And so that really kind of took away from, I think, anything going on, because I couldn't buy, like I was where the dad was coming from, which was where Rex was coming from. Like, how could you end up with this guy?
He's kind of dull.
He's dull and just shallow.
Ambitious, right? New York financial advisor, man.
And maybe, yeah, I just didn't see anything. Like there, it partly was a lack of chemistry, but partly after all we see Jeannette go through, how could she end up with this guy?
I think she does choose this guy because he's safe, because he's stable, because he's like the antithesis of her father. Like, we all marry our fathers theoretically. She wanted to marry the exact opposite of her father. So maybe that, but he's not characterized very well, but beyond being blandly safe. Yes.
Right, blandly safe, and then when they fight, it's this like, he's so selfish about it. Like there's almost no acknowledgement of who she is as a person, which is just frustrating to see, right? Whereas I feel like the movie is a bit more measured with how it treats Rex, because as much as he's off his rocker, and I think the deeper, more interesting version of a character like that we see when Viggo Mortensen is in Captain Fantastic, and I thought about that movie a lot in this.
Similar territory.
Similar territory in this, somebody trying to kind of basically live off the grid and call out some of society's insanity, and and there's stuff that he says like, okay, he's not wrong, but God, he's such a, and what he'll go through, there are moments of lucidity when he's sober, but you see over the course of time, the alcoholism really takes its toll on him to the point that what good is there is really hard to, it's hard to get past all of the crap, right? And so I think, yes, obviously Jeannette Walls has this really complicated view of her father, and I think that the movie doesn't really deliver on that, which is kind of frustrating. And I found it to be more intellectually interesting, but it never, I said to you after the screening, it's more intellectually interesting, just kind of like, wow, this was a real person and they really lived that way, and this is stuff that this guy had to have said about that. And maybe there was something there that he tried, but the alcoholism kept him back, but I never felt the emotion that you should feel from her towards him.
Well, it's more powerful and more emotionally clear in the flashbacks.
Yeah.
And what's so strange and so frustrating about this movie is that in the 1989 segment with Brie Larson, like they have made her totally inert. It's strange. She's like a passenger in her own life a lot of the time. And maybe that's because it's a 2-box again. Hi 2-box. If you're back, are you back?
The 2-box.
Hi,
Ooh,
2-box.
The 2-box.
Have you seen that before?
No.
I know.
Ooh.
Anyway,
2-box.
the thing, here, hold on, do this. No, do cheers. Clink, there you go.
The off camera clink.
So, what was I saying? So the thing is, because she's created this facade for herself in her mid-20s, she's starting her career in journalism, she's kind of dull. And it's hard to make Brie Larson dull because she has this really, like, bracing naturalism about her. Like she's impossible to stop watching. She's naturally very magnetic, and they made her kind of boring with the hair and the shoulder pads and the pearls. And maybe that again is by design because it's the facade she's created for herself to make herself seem like a normal person. But it is hard to connect with her in those segments, and then eventually the cracks show and emotion shows through, and then we see the actress that she truly can be. But the way that she's written for a long time is kind of dull, weirdly so, and hard to connect with.
It's hard to connect with, and what's another thing that's frustrating is you want to see some level of, okay, if that's, I think partly the dichotomy so early on is where it doesn't really connect the dots. Like you don't ever really see how, especially because you get a scene later in her life, a college scene. And she kind of springs forward from this movie, like at the beginning of the movie when you see adult Jeannette, she's so closed up and I felt like you never see anything in the movie where the journey that young Jeannette is on teaches her to button up and teaches her that like to survive, I have to do this. Especially because you get a line from her sister when she says, oh, you're gonna love New York, it's like being able to breathe again, right? Well, okay, but then she goes to New York and she doesn't breathe and she's all rigid. And
that's a good point, yeah.
Right, and you see her open up from that, but you don't see, the movie doesn't give you the lessons of her as a young child, like, or a younger person, I have to keep back, I have to hold back, I have to hold back. Because as much as they're hiding out from and doing their own thing and being self-reliant when it comes to their father making their plans, they still talk to him. They still are kind of caught up in that madness. So,
and then it all kind of wraps up in a tidy way.
Yeah.
It's really, it's harrowing and it's in individual moments, and then it all wraps up in a way that it wants us to feel good about how this is all resolved. And then they have actual photographs and actual footage, because it wasn't that long ago. They have footage of her parents in the 80s, homeless, scavenging on the streets of New York, and they moved there to be closer to her and her sister. So that stuff is kind of more interesting because the characters pop as, because they're not characters at that point, they're actual people, and I want to see those people. Maybe like a documentary about this would be,
as they're squatting and like he's looking out that window and talking about gentrification, and you're like, that's coming. That's the movie I want to see.
It's coming to the Lower East Side, and it has come. He was right. So anyway, I'm real mixed on this. I'm giving it a 5. I reviewed it for RogerEbert.com, and I gave it 2 stars out of 4. So 5 for me.
5.5. All
right, so our number is a 5.3. Kind of a bummer. Bye.
Yeah.